Okay, so throughout the course, it's a slow reading seminar that we've been taking with Dr. Andrea Ballestero. And throughout the course, which is of course focusing on different methods and strategies of slow reading, looking at practices or thinking about practices, as well as how to approach content. Um, and we've read various works. We've begun with Sylvia Wynter, gone through Trio, a lot of other um, uh, authors as well, like Jenna Reutman, thinking through crisis, and also looking into speculative anthropology and kind of the SF turn. And so I guess for our first question that we have for you, which I'll just read, is throughout our class, we've been discussing how to precipitate insights and or thoughts that one might not predict at the beginning of a research project. What are your thoughts on ethnography as a way of thinking, and whether it allows us to approach the unexpected, or in Michel Rothriot's language, to remain open to the unthinkable? And we did share a quote from the book that we circulated to you in advance. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of my favorite trio essays, actually. So I teach that essay quite a bit. And, I think that part of his point is really to say that in some ways we're all prisoners of our formation, you know, and that we can think outside the parameters that we've been given, into which we've been socialized and disciplined, only to a certain degree, right? Which in some ways is why every generation that is attempting to transform the world, has to take the previous generation's work further, because the previous generation could only think so far outside of the paradigms that were normative to them. And I think that's also why um, science fiction and other forms of Afrofuturism or futuristic thinking generally can be so appealing, because the attempt there is to let go of the normative paradigms that structure our thinking, our doing, our institution building, our interactions with students, our classrooms, etc. And I guess in some ways, really, this pandemic has been sort of the closest thing to enacting a complete change in how we do things, how we interact. I mean, my classes have transformed completely, and I think I'll keep them that way. But I wouldn't have necessarily been impelled to do that unless I had to be forced into a new situation that's opened up all sorts of new avenues, even as it's closed off some things that I really miss about the classroom situation. But, insofar as those kinds of things happen during a research process, whether it's something as totalizing as a pandemic, turning the world upside down in some ways, and then also revealing the real structural parameters of the world as it is in others, um, or it's something more local in a way, um, attempts to connect with people that fail, or projects that were imagined that fall apart for whatever reason, and one has to kind of retool, and one is confronted with the necessity of kind of rethinking, reformulating. But I guess, you know, in some ways, the benefit of being a little further along in this process, um, and I will at some point again have to write a grant proposal in the kinds of ways that you are now writing. If you're a third year, you're probably now like struggling to finish your Venner grant and SSRC and all of that that's due next week, but or tomorrow or whenever it's due. At any rate, I find myself in the very, very privileged position of kind of wandering, and because I continue to work in Jamaica, which is in many ways home. Um, and because I'm back, probably 4 times a year, I'm and obviously constantly in communication with people, then I'm always just following things, and sort of seeing where they lead and trying to make sense of disparate things that I'm hearing. So for the last several years, as the Chinese investment presence has heightened quite a bit, I've been sort of trying to figure out what kind of project, research wise and film wise, would be possible here. I don't speak Mandarin. I could learn maybe, but is that the direction I would go in? Is this about looking at a particular industry, and which of course in Jamaica and elsewhere in the Caribbean would be construction, either road construction or infrastructure construction, and trying to understand the influence of the massive Chinese investment. Is it looking at their attempts to build a deep water port, and sort of thinking through the environmental activism that has arisen because of that? Is it people's anxieties, how their anxieties about this Chinese presence, this intensified Chinese presence is being expressed? Is it the relationship between the older Chinese Jamaican community, because of course there are Chinese Jamaicans, from the 19th century, and of course throughout Latin America as well, their relationship with the new Chinese, what is it, how is it I want to focus, and I think what I've landed on by following different strands like this, just not in a kind of totalizing research way, but just in a curious way, has been to now think about, and this is in some ways very trio, think about the death of the West, and remember that, okay, 1492 as a rubric, if you've read Winter and you've read Trio, is the inaugural moment for a completely new dispensation globally, right? It's the beginning of a new form of economic organization. It's the beginning of new labor arrangements. It's the beginning of the sort of movement toward a liberal political project of democracy. It's the beginning of state consolidation in Europe. It's the beginning of the racial hierarchies. It's native dispossession. This is the beginning of modernity, right? So what if we saw what's happening now not as kind of a ragtag combination of things that are going on, but actually as a new epoch, and what would it mean to try to do an ethnography of an epochal shift, when we often don't realize these things are happening as they're happening. It's only after the fact that we can look back and say, oh, 1492, the West, the beginning of the modern West, And so like, what is that date going to be for us 100 years from now, looking back and saying, things got completely turned around in different directions, and what kind of shift is it really? And where can we see it happening on the ground, in ways that we can identify? And I think insofar as it's unthinkable that the project of the West is dead or dying or exhausted, and that we're seeing the end of a version of empire, in that way, like I want to see how that could be thinkable, and I want to explore ways of looking at that. And what that means, of course, is that our traditional kind of toolkits and our traditional modalities have to be pushed a bit, because there's no sort of, and in ways that they've been pushed over the last 30-40 years, but even further in some ways. What are the sites of epical shift? How do you do participant observation, deeply rooted collaborative participatory long-term fieldwork, on something that you can't really pinpoint as like, there aren't meetings about it, for example, you know. So that's sort of what I'm grappling with right now and trying to think through. And one of the things I've been doing is there was a big project proposed, um, the Chinese company that wanted to do the deep water port and logistics hub in one area on the southern coast of Jamaica, the Goat Islands, which had actually previously been where the US leased land because they built an airstrip during World War II there, and that since became a drag racing venue. And anyway, the Chinese were looking at that site. And the proposal was that there was going to be what's called an aerotropolis, right? So there would be a deep water port, and then, the road inland to where the airstrip is now, but the airstrip would be widened, and the same people who were moved in order to build the airstrip for the Americans will now again be moved and relocated and maybe compensated, in order to build this logistics hub. And it would be the third or fourth, I think it's Rotterdam, Dubai, and then, Jamaica would be like the third or fourth logistics hub globally, and, the plans about it are very breathless, when the member of parliament is announcing it and talking about it and how many jobs and how they're going to transform the local high school in a kind of aerotech direction, and how this is going to really bring development to this particular rural area of Jamaica and put Jamaica on the map. And, again, as the first landmass coming out of the Panama Canal, we have this kind of privileged position, the gateway to the Mediterranean and to Africa and to Asia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, as with all such grand plans, they're not linear, so I have a lot of footage that we've been shooting of the airstrip, of the kind of surrounding areas, and of the little fisherman's beach, which is sort of ultimately where the deep water port would be. And so there's, there are signs up that say, oh, the airstrip will be closed on X date. Of course, we were still driving it long past that date. There was bushing done on the road to the sea, but then 3 months later, it had all grown up again. So step one has been taken several times, and it's, in a way, it's this kind of, is the apocalypse coming or is it not? And like so I say that to say, like, maybe the West is dead, but maybe not, and I think one has to always be open for these stops and starts. And so one of the ways that I'm trying to get at that is visually, by sort of at different times. I'll probably do some kind of timeline film, I suppose, at some point, but at different times, trying to capture the change or lack thereof on the landscape, and sort of, that kind of an extended approach that's different from the normative kind of embedded fieldwork extended approach, just as one section of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, for that beautiful response. And we can go ahead and move on to the next question.
And so I can ask that one. We talked about in our class that we are focusing on reading practices. And so one of the things we really wanted to ask was what reading is for you as an ethnographer, as many other things other than an ethnographer, and what are your favorite forms of reading?
What is reading to me? Well, sometimes reading is just reading, and that too always feels like a kind of privileged moment to just delve into stuff and sit with some books and get inspired, by other people's work, and sort of think about how does that affect the ways I'm thinking about my own. And I guess reading, though, encompasses, you know, much more than that. Certainly reading for me is also about creative work. Um, you know, as a former dancer, so much of the kind of assimilation of the world that I'm used to, even though I'm not dancing professionally anymore, is really embodied, you know, and because embodied, then relational in particular kinds of ways. So, you know, if sort of corporeal reading is a form of reading, I guess that's also very important to me. How are people and how am I moving, you know, and in all the senses of that term, both in space, in my emotions, in other people's emotions, in their space, across space, um, and politically as well. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, reading is just living, you know, and being engaged with others, you know, other people, my students, my kids, my husband, my family, my colleagues, um, people who I work with in various kinds of ways, both here and in Jamaica. It's that, and I think that's what we all are missing right now is, or at least that's what I'm missing right now, is the kind of constant um, food that is the interactions. You know, I mean, I'm of course getting a lot of food from my household, you know, which is great, you know, but I miss the ways that we feed each other and that are more expansive and more outside, you know, my family, because I always feel like, um, you know, there's never an idea that I've come to on my own, you know, like it's always about the engagement, um, whether that's a creative engagement or it's a, you know, research engagement, which for me is often creative anyway, but, you know, or a faculty meeting even, or just like, you know, I feel like we're all missing that kind of push that we get, the sparks from human interaction outside of the screen. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Um, and I guess the next question that we had in relationship to that would be like, how might these practices inform your writing or scholarly practices? You know, you spoke of corporeal reading and embodiment and relationality. And how do you think that informs maybe even what we read, the political life in the wake of Plantation?
Mm. Um, I think it's hard to, or it takes a special kind of skill that I'm not sure I have to write about um, the affective embodied dimensions of research, engagement, interaction, etc. It took me a really long time to figure out how to write that first chapter. And I was very dissatisfied for quite a while, just because I couldn't find a voice that would evoke what we all felt when we were in the recording studio together, or when we were walking around the community, or in the engagements, you know, afterwards, the back and forth about how we should edit things, you know, that whole process. And, you know, I had given a couple talks or workshops, some stuff with friends who were like, oh, this is awful. You know, and I was like, I know, I can't find like the way to express it, you know, and they're like, well, and I don't know what happened. I don't know, I had to go to a West Indies literature conference and I was on a panel with a couple of friends of mine that was on Kingston. It was, the city or whatever. And I just started kind of writing out, not not kind of insights derived from research, but the process of walking together over the course of doing the research. And it felt much more, it felt to me as if it reflected much more the ways that we were learning as we were going and being affected by the interactions, by people's narratives. And then as we, probed, I think, some of the historical material, it gave those those engagements and interactions a different kind of depth. So in many ways, I think the audience dictates the form. Like once you sort of figure out who the audience is, it helps you understand what to make, and I think figuring out in the writing portion of it anyway, that because I had never actually intended to write about the 2010 events that had just originally intended to be, had been intended to be a audiovisual project. But as I started writing about the process of walking together, that made more sense textually, and then the audience for that, developed in different ways, and then it became this book. So obviously there are different audiences, but initially the audience for that was people who were already familiar with what happened, with the landscape, with the problems and the histories behind the problems. And so I could write with a great deal more familiarity about those subjects, and didn't have to do the kind of analytic distancing that often happens when one is trying to make legible. So, one of the critiques that I've had, and I don't know if you all felt this way reading it, but from readers who are unfamiliar with some of the, important historical high points or whatever, is that they wanted more. They wanted me to say more. They wanted to know more about these different events that I might mention, but not talk about a lot or whatever. And I hear that, but I think for me, like, that's not so important with this text anyway. That wasn't my audience, and the installation is here. I'm in my office at the Penn Museum, and so when we were shooting and when we were collecting materials and when we were thinking about the installation, our minds are in Jamaica, and so when we were doing it here, the exhibition staff said, okay, so what's the takeaway for our audience? And we were like, that is a really good question, And so, we had to kind of retool and think about, well, why would anybody here care about these events, and what can it be linked to that's important for, Philadelphian school children or American ethnographic museum audiences, or these kinds of people. What will make it not just this weird thing about this weird place somewhere, so we decided to highlight sort of US intervention throughout Latin America and the Caribbean throughout the 20th century, with the idea that, people should know what their government is doing in their name, and, see this as part of a broader process. It's not just this little island that maybe you know because you went on vacation, something, but actually it's part of a broader hemispheric project of security during the Cold War. And also, for Philly, and you all are too young to know about this probably, but there was a big bombing of a community here in West Philly called the Move organization. And there actually was recently, Michael Africa did a film, 40 years later or something, that just screened in the Philadelphia Film Festival. But that's heavy on people's minds here. So I heard a lot of people walk through and say, this is just like Move, And so there are things that people will connect to about the incidence of state violence. And of course, everybody has been more attuned to these matters, since this past Memorial Day. So at any rate, that was that we had to think about what this audience how this audience could be affected by this exhibit. The longer documentary is another thing, that's really for Jamaicans, and it's for the community's audience, or for the audience they set. It's really for kind of uptown people, human rights people, people who they think can then pressure the government, or an international human rights thing. But we also wanted to see if we could get middle class audiences to be open enough watching it to kind of think about their own involvement in ways that we never do. Like, how do you support political tribalism, political violence in your day-to-day engagements? In what ways are you implicated in maintaining these kinds of systems, that ultimately are systems that make other people insecure. So that was that. But then I started showing that documentary in some classrooms in the US, and I was really kind of unhappy with the response. And again, it's due to the familiarity question. When you show the film in Jamaica, people understand the visual landscape. They know what that building is, if it's blue on the bottom and white on the top. They know what this particular place signifies. They know what they're looking at, and American university student audiences, unless they're Jamaican, didn't know what they were looking at, and so there were a lot of questions that they had that I thought distracted them from feeling what people were saying, about what happened to them. So I then called Junior Wedderburn, one of my collaborators, and said, we have to make something else. We have to make something totally nonlinear, no narrative, just impressions, and see if it can have the kind of affective impact, that we want to have, like, can we create something that moves people without them having to worry about, wait, what happened first? Wait, what was that? I don't understand, like, because that's all distracting. That's taking us out of sort of sitting with people, and so we created this shorter piece also, which I can send you a link to if you want. But and it's interesting because people who have seen both, Americans or otherwise, feel like they feel the weight of the state much more in the doc with narratives than they do in the sort of experimental nonlinear film. And in that film, they feel the creativity of people more, which I think is interesting. I mean, in part that stands to reason because, of course, people are talking about the weight of the state and, them having come into their community and going door to door and rounding up, youth and torturing them. And, of course, you would feel that in a different way, but it's something about that juxtaposition that I think is really interesting. But all that to say that in each case, the audience really dictated the form in the text work and in the visual work as well.
Thank you for that. I think that actually dovetailed really nicely with our last question. And so since we are out of time, I think that actually works perfectly for the last question.
Dr. Thomas, this was really, really exciting and complements, what we've been working on for the past few weeks with this work.